Hello, and welcome to the Adaptive Edge of Education. My name's Miranda Shorty, and I'm your host. Today with me, I have the fabulous Neil Kelly, who I have the privilege of knowing as a member of my doctoral cohort, but also as someone that I have collaborated with on some recent publications. He's incredibly hardworking and motivated and positive. I'm super lucky to have him in my life. He is also a middle school science teacher. So shout out to all those folks just hanging in there in middle school. And he's an openly gay male from a conservative Catholic background. And today he would like to talk about a topic that is incredibly important and valuable to him. And so I will let you take it away, Neil, if you'll tell us a little bit about what topic you'd like to discuss and your experience with it.
Thank you, Miranda. And thank you for having me. This is such a wonderful opportunity, and I'm so excited to be here and to share my thoughts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. So DEI for me is really all about removing barriers that we see kind of crop up in multiple facets of everyday life and in society and in organizations. But obviously this is more geared towards school, towards public education. And removing barriers can look like one of many different things. It can look like barriers that have impeded a child's learning, whether that's some sort of disability or neurodivergence, or barriers just in terms of how someone identifies and how that means of identification has served or not served them in accessing the education that they deserve. DEI for me is really about embracing each individual as the human being that they are, whether they identify in terms of their ethnicity one way or their sexual orientation another way, or their race. It's really about embracing the whole person and taking that way of embracing a human being and uplifting and empowering them and giving them the same opportunities as anybody else to be able to attain the level of success and well-being that anyone is really entitled to. And in this case, accessing an education that will serve them for a lifetime. I think about my students when I think about this topic, and I think about the so many different walks of life that my students bring with them when they come into my classroom. And I've taught in a few different states, and I've taught in a few different contexts, and I've had students that have had an array of exceptional gifts about them. I've had students with so many different talents and so many different gifts that they bring to the classroom. I've had students that come to me with an array of different identities and ways that they identify as themselves and their families and their upbringing. And then I think about some of the challenges that I've observed in my observations as a middle school science teacher, and even just in my personal interactions with them. I really get to see them in a lot of different contexts, and I get to see them really shine, and I get to really, unfortunately, I do see their struggles, and I see the things that have gotten in the way before, not just necessarily academic, but also barriers that are a bit more personal to them that have prevented them from being their best selves. And some of those are a bit more structural, and some of them are systemic. And as time has gone on and I've gotten a little more well-versed being a teacher, I've been able to really see those things manifest in the classroom, in the systems that we have in schools that, maybe once served the population well years and years ago, but are no longer serving, right? These are things that we've just come to be more cognizant of as time has gone on. And it's empowered me to really, really think about the practices, the policies, and the ways that we're really helping these kids with these barriers, overcoming these barriers. So diversity, equity, and inclusion for me is really it's really taking the time to understand diversity, understand what equity really means in a classroom setting or even at an organizational level, and then really thinking about the ways that we can change what we do and how we do it so that we're continuing to remove layers of these barriers over time. And it's not a process that happens overnight. This is a process that takes a lot of time. But I think those little steps add up to a lot. And the more that we reflect upon those and act with intentionality, the better off we are for kids and really for everybody.
So I love your frame of reference for DEI that mentions removing barriers. And it makes me think a lot of Young Zhao's book that we discussed in one of our prior classes, in terms of like understanding the ways in which we create barriers within education without even really realizing how everything can kind of be a barrier to the learning experience.
Right.
I think that that's a really great way of understanding it. I don't know if I would have included that in my definition, but I totally agree with it. So in fact, I think your definition of DEI is much more eloquent than what mine was going to be. So I appreciate that. I tend to think of, and I wanted to mention this to you or get your thoughts on this. When I think of DEI related issues, my mind initially goes to concepts within the 6 protections of the Civil Rights Acts in terms of protecting people from discrimination and harassment based on race, ethnicity, national origin, gender identity, sexual identity, religion, disability. That's kind of where I go to. But logically, my brain sees those sociological minority groups as so much more vast than just those 6. I think those 6 being the Civil Rights Act's protections only is kind of a barrier by itself.
Right.
And when I do this work with my students, when we kind of break down characters within novels, I usually ask them to look at the wheel of power and privilege.
Right.
And I ask them to identify where they see their character having positions of power or privilege, or having positions of being marginalized or even vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think that's the first step in all of this, is really just identifying where is it happening, because we can be so well intentioned and we can have things that we don't even realize that we're doing that we're inadvertently or indirectly discriminating against somebody, or I mean obviously it can be very overt sometimes as well, but I think the first step, as you said, is really just naming it, identifying it, and that can be hard work for sure. So that's impressive
On
for kids.
on that wheel, there's 12 different classifications to consider. So there's citizenship, skin color, formal education, ability, sexuality, neurodiversity, mental health, body size, housing, wealth, language, and gender. So they obviously take way more different identity markers into consideration when breaking down these positions of privilege and power versus positions of marginalization or vulnerability. And I've seen wheels that are even larger, that have 20 or 30 different identity markers that can classify people in this way. Some of the ones that I like that aren't even on this one, but I think could be, or areas to talk about, are age. And that's largely in part because I feel so so strongly about lack of autonomy and agency and efficacy in children.
Right.
So I think, and also in people from mature portions of our community, I think there's a lack of agency and autonomy there too. I think that it would be really nice if we would include family dynamics somewhere on the wheel. I think there's area for DEI work within people that come from single parent households, adoptive households, foster, whatever the different family dynamic is. And so any of those things to me really could be considered too. And I know there's quite a few of them, but it's very difficult to think about all of the things without considering first, like, what are the areas I would be blind to because this isn't this isn't an area of marginalization or vulnerability that I fall under.
Right, and that's where, I would argue it takes a village. It takes
Mhm.
this is not a one person kind of job. Like, there's going to be plenty of things that I'm blind to, and I don't mean any ill by that, and I don't mean any harm by that. But having, this be a team effort and having perspectives from a lot of different people, that it's powerful. And I think, through that we really leverage a tool that enables us to add more to that wheel, or to really just continue to refine how we're looking at it, or the factors that we keep in mind when we're considering, ways of discrimination, or ways that power and privilege are distributed. We're very kind of, when I think about this, we pull from a lot of our past experiences and our identities when we're really thinking about this. So having as much kind of perspective from different viewpoints or lenses is really impactful when it comes to this stuff.
And I also like how you talked about in your definition of DEI as an educational challenge, the idea that it takes time. And I think this is a real struggle in education because we feel like we don't have that time. By that,
Right.
I mean, this is kind of at crisis levels in education in terms of how frequently throughout our day we're dealing with issues of diversity, equity, or inclusion amongst our students, amongst our staff, amongst members of our community. And it feels like we need help now. Like we've kicked the can down the road so far that intense amount of time that it takes to develop uh, effective um, system solutions to adaptive challenges. We just don't have it anymore. Is that fair to say? Like, do you understand what I'm saying?
Could you clarify when you say that it's a matter of time and that we've kicked the can for
Sure,
so long? Yeah.
sure. I think we've been talking about DEI for a long time. And
Yeah.
what I've noticed in some of the research that I did on this particular topic was how many people mentioned that if you're going to implement DEI related initiatives or strategies, protocol, policies into your school, that you have to remove illusions about it.
Right.
And at first, I wasn't really sure what that meant, but looking more into it, what they were saying was it's not enough to just have meetings about the fact that there is a problem, identify that there is a problem. We have to also develop ideas of how to address the problem with fidelity to actually fixing it.
Right.
And I think that's where the biggest resistance is. Because
I
I
would
think and I know this is like, I'm bordering on controversial here, but that's okay. I don't care. I'll go there because whatever. That's my that's my style. I think I don't think I've witnessed resistance to actual genuine ideas for removing marginalization and vulnerability for different members, sociological minority members of school communities, because the people that would have to do the work to remove those barriers don't actually want to be on the same playing field as everyone else. There's advantage to their privilege and they're not super comfortable giving it up.
Right, for a host of reasons, because this
Right.
is this is like you said, it can be very controversial work. I would
Mhm.
absolutely agree that more, and I've seen it definitely in my context and my teaching situation and in multiple situations, where we talk a good talk, and we can certainly, we can certainly do a lot of talking, but it's a matter of actually walking the walk and then actually executing, or trying out different things that are going to, or what we hope will affect a genuine difference. And I think, people in these positions of power really kind of get, they could, like you said, they could either be, just simply, saying it to say it and not actually have the intentionality of doing anything about it, or it could be a matter of them losing their jobs because the people that they are working under, don't share the same beliefs, or they're just doing it to check a box. I think there's a lot of that tends to happen, and it goes back to the idea of where's this privilege, where's this power and this privilege, kind of coming from, and it can
And
be a really difficult challenge to address.
and is it being and is someone else's power or privilege being threatened? Because that
Right.
makes people feel uncomfortable. We know it does. We know it does because we see the signs during the holidays about making sure that we keep Christ in Christmas, or
Yep.
making sure that people are quote allowed to say Merry Christmas in school, end quote. Yes, you're allowed to say Merry Christmas in school. You can say Happy Holidays. You can say whatever you want. No one gets in trouble for that, right? That's not a real thing. But the minute we suggest that we incorporate other people's celebrations, other people's cultures into being represented in public arenas where those other religious practices and cultures are existent, that creates a dynamic of threat against the majority population. And that's where this like perceived loss of culture that isn't actually happening comes from, right?
Right.
Because it's not really, I'm afraid that you're going to make it impossible for me to practice my culture. It's, I think you're going to make it not as much of a dominant culture, and I'm going to lose a position of privilege or power.
Right. Right.
And that's what I really worry about being at the heart of some of these issues related to DEI, is how do we convince people who've been in positions of power or privilege for a very long time that they aren't losing anything by relinquishing that power and privilege to give opportunities to other people from different identification markers or statuses or cultural groups the same level of position and influence.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's something that jumps out to me in all of this too when we talk about these people in positions of authority who has privilege or this sense of loss. I think about the people that are in these leadership roles, or people that have a lot of this power. And I think about the different generations of people that are out there. And I think there's a generation of individuals who have this level of power, this level of privilege, that are in a generation where they're kind of set in I don't they're kind of just set in their ways. They're set. They have this ideology, or this this very firm belief, or this notion to hold on to what they believe, has
And this
served.
perseverating rhetoric that comes
Yeah.
out, same
Yeah.
rhetoric over and over again. And it's not even really their own, but it perseverates in their mind because they hear it so frequently that they internalize it. It becomes what they think they believe. Right.
Right, right. And I
And
do think that there's a shift in terms of the generation of educators like ourselves, and a lot of people that are kind of emerging, or starting to take more roles in leadership and education. I think there's a shift. I think, but it goes back to this idea that it's going to take time, and it's going to take I'm going to say the right people. That's not the right
mhm,
expression, but to assume, or to begin to assume more of those roles to help kind of change this narrative. And I think that's going to, like we said, it's going to take time, and it's going to happen in pockets. And it's probably something that we'll see more of in certain regions of our country, less so than others. It goes back to this idea of time, and
mhm.
beginning to actually walk the walk and talk the talk at the same time. And that's not, obviously, that's not to say it's not going to be met without resistance, and it's not going to be met. There'll be times where people disagree, and there's going to be times where people are really vocal about that. And
Mhm.
uh, it's really finding ways to kind of overcome that, and to continue to honor those perspectives, and to include those stakeholders in decisions, and informing policy, but also just keeping into account and prioritizing what's right by kids, what's right by overcoming these barriers, as I had mentioned
Mhm.
earlier. And that's hard work, especially when people, have are wielding the power to funding for different, educational endeavors, or people are, the ones that are making the policies, or the ones that are really at the helm of what gets said or done.
Are
Um,
we talking about Diane Ravitch's book right now?
we might be.
Honest to God, I'm pretty sure I've talked about it on almost every single episode of this podcast because it
It's
was
so
so
true, though. She hits the nail
powerful
right
for
on
me.
the head. It's so
She hit
true.
the nail on, and I had no idea, Neil, the level to which this shadow government, this kind of underlying powerhouse of economic influence,
Hmm.
was reshaping and redefining education over and over again with zero data to show their effectiveness in doing so.
Right.
And her book was so powerful for me. But you're right, she talks frequently about how there are these small interest groups that are funded with tremendous economic support that are able to reshape something based on their minority opinion of how one aspect that could be related to DEI should look. And they can subsequently put into place people who will vote for their ability to create schools and fund schools that push that one agenda.
Right.
And that's a huge barrier to the idea of DEI. That's a massive barrier. That's so secular.
It
That's
is.
like you're going to learn education in this tiny vacuum over here, and you guys are going to learn education in this other vacuum over here, and you folks, welcome to this slightly larger but less well-funded vacuum over here. And that's really dangerous to me. I don't love that.
Yeah, it is dangerous, and it's true that it's such an unfortunate reality that we're contending with. But I think the fact that we know that that is what's going on, and we understand that this is kind of the dynamic that is happening at, a much more, from positions where people have more authority and more power, it gives us that much more to think about, and to an empowerment to at least try to make change, or to affect changes even at a smaller level. Like you know some of these problems can get, they're really, really large, and they take a lot of time, and they take a lot of resources to get people to kind of relinquish certain, or change the way that they think, or kind of be willing to consider different ideas. um,
Mhm.
and I kind of think back to Melinda's change theory, where change is a process that takes a lot of time, and change is something that doesn't come overnight. And you're going to have some people that are, they're early pioneers, they're willing to try out things right away, and they're willing to jump right into it. You're going to have people kind of in the middle of the road that are going to want to kind of, maybe toe dip a little bit, but ultimately kind of kick back, see how it goes. And then if it goes well for those early pioneers, they'll jump on the bandwagon, and they'd be willing to try those things. And then you're going to have some other people that um, unfortunately will just be resistant of your best efforts, or the best efforts of those before them, or in different stages of that change process, where they are just recalcitrant. They don't want to change the way that they do things. So I think,
Right.
I think about all of this, and I think about this change theory, and how, DEI practices, are things that a lot of people in these positions of power, or that have the funding that they're exercising to influence the way that schools operate. They're unfortunately, they remind me of these people that are, very hesitant to enact any kind of change that they don't see as being beneficial to kids, or to a specific population of students that they're interested in.
Which then, like Zhao was talking about, they become a, well, he calls them a border, but a barrier.
He calls them what?
He calls them a border, right? Like the borders or learning without borders.
Yeah.
But it's a barrier, really. They become a barrier to accessing knowledge, aspects of education and experience, and ways of understanding. They become an ideological barrier
Right.
for
Right.
students. in
And
that
that
role.
becomes an adaptive issue. That is a very big adaptive issue, right? That's
Right.
changing somebody's mindset, right? That's not a structural issue that can be corrected by changing the schedule or, just something surface level. That's something that takes time. And those are certainly people that hold stakes in education. But as we've kind of come to learn through this program and through this process, when it comes to adaptive issues, we it's not, this is a solution that, or this is a challenge that takes time for sure, and it takes kind of influencing, or it takes some influencing of these individuals over time to kind of understand, or to at least see that what's trying to be done, or what is the ultimate goal of all of this, is a goal that is what is right by all students, by all people, by all walks of life, um, by the greatest number of people possible.
I
I don't.
just
Go ahead.
worry. This is where I struggle with this. And well, I struggle with anything that takes a tremendous amount of time because that's not my strong suit. When I see something that's detrimental or harmful or oppressive or disenfranchising for my student, I don't want to waste time. I want change to happen immediately. And I will tell you, I know logically it takes time. This is an anecdote, a side story, but I have a member of my family who I love and adore, who I think is an incredibly kind and thoughtful and open-hearted individual. And one time I was young. I think I was still in high school, and I know you're considerably younger than me, so you probably weren't even born yet. But I was still in high school, and it was when many states were beginning the discussion of whether or not to legalize gay marriage.
Right.
And he said to me, "Well, I don't support it because they want special rights," and that became part of a rhetoric that was floating around. And he is a cis, white, heterosexual male with very few marginalized or vulnerable identity markers, right?
Right.
And I said, "No, they don't." And he said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I'm sick of people saying it's special rights. It's not a special right. You get to marry a person that you've fallen in love with,
Yep.
and people that are gay currently can't marry and have the protection of marriage with a person that they've fallen in love with. So it's not the same. You're saying they want special rights, but it's the same rights and they don't have them and they deserve them." And his whole world changed after that comment, but it took a little time. It
Oh yeah.
changed so much that recently he officiated a wedding for a homosexual couple. So a gay marriage. And although I hate using the term gay marriage, but you know what I mean. A marriage between two people of the same gender. There we go. And he actually officiated a wedding.
That's wonderful.
And so
That's
that's a huge shift over time, right?
that.
But it did take time. I mean, you're not wrong. It took a while to get there. I know that him challenging that rhetoric in his mind began with that impetus where I called him on that statement that I knew had been floating around in his community and in his culture that I just didn't
Right.
align with. And
And
it started
sometimes it's just a matter of planting that seed to kind of promulgate that change, or to even just get someone to think about it and to reconsider their thinking, or to change, to really just change how they think, right? I'll give an anecdote too. When I first started teaching as, a gay male years ago, I was 22. I got my first teaching position in
Mhm.
middle school. I went in and I was very afraid of sharing my identity with my students. In fact, I worried that if I had confided in my identity with them years ago, that it could have cost me my job. And it was actually at a point where I decided to kind of keep that away from my coworkers as well, right? I would never really allude to, like in the teacher room, I would never allude to relationships, anything like that kind of comes up in casual conversation.
And I
Um,
understand. I know teachers who still to this day will not reveal, even in, situations where it would be totally appropriate to make a statement that would subsequently reveal their relationship status with another person and identify them as not being strictly heterosexual. They will not do it.
Yeah, and I think for some people that's a true challenge, and it can come from their background, it can come from their experiences, it can come from one of several different things. And with people like that, in my experience, I don't push. I've learned not to push too hard, but I do want to plant a seed. I think planting that seed is probably the biggest first step to take, and then just letting it kind of sit for a bit. Um, for me, like, I was in a very similar boat where that was just the way it was. I just wasn't going to say anything. I wasn't going to share any bit of that. And it took time, but about 2 years ago, I was finishing, no, 2 or 3 years ago, I was finishing my master's capstone project, this action research project I had to do. And it was a project where, kids were given these genius hour projects where they got to choose a topic they were interested in, really become experts about the topic, and create some sort of tangible product to really showcase their learning. And it was wonderful. And I went through multiple iterations of it. I looked at engagement, I looked at empowerment and autonomy. I looked at it was a lot of qualitative data that really showed the benefit of giving kids this opportunity. And it was in the final stage of that project that my a colleague at the time, she did ELA and social studies, I did math and science, and she wanted to extend it into a social justice related topic where the kids could pick a social justice topic that resonated with them, become more knowledgeable about it, and take the time to really share the perspectives. And this was the seed that really changed my perspective on all this. Most of my kids, or quite a few of my kids, went to LGBTQ issues. They went right to the topics of gay marriage, and they were all they all really became like, it was just so impressive to see everything from Black Lives Matter to gay marriage to just about everything that you could think of. And
Right.
it was magic to see them really understand and mind you, these were fifth graders. These were
Right.
young students that were really
Space.
taking on some big issues.
Mhm.
It was the end of that year. I was so moved by that whole experience, and I was moved by those kids. It planted a seed for me to share my identity with them. And I remember the last day of school, um, and mind you, I was moving to a different state, so they all knew that I was not returning that year, that I shared with them my identity and background, and that I'm a gay male, that I went through a lot of the struggles that these people that you took the time to really get to know, and their struggles, it's something that really resonated with me, and I wanted to share that with you, and how very fortunate and blessed I feel to be with all of you, and to know that you're going to be the change makers for the future. And it was, oh, Miranda, it was just the most impactful. It was a pivotal moment in my career, and
Sure, it was beautiful.
and now it's at a point now where I will start the school year with a slideshow for my 7th and 8th grade students, and I will share that element of my identity with them. I started doing that, not this past school year, the school year before, my preferred pronouns, and even just this past year, I did it again. And I even shared my coming out story with my students. And then it was shortly after sharing that coming out story with my students that I had 2 or 3 come forward and share their struggles with their identity. So it might have been my little mark in the 4 walls of my classroom, but to have helped remove a barrier, a social identity barrier that would have otherwise, continued to be a barrier, or to continue to have, held them back in some capacity. It was entirely and completely worth it. And I think it's those small little changes, those small little seeds that we can plant over time, that at least I hope and I aspire to create, or to add up to a big difference as time continues to wear on.
I mean, I think that what could be more powerful or more empowering than hearing a story like that from a person who you respect, who's brilliant and wonderful and kind and successful and supportive, and to hear a story like that, that even if it's just one kid resonates with and is like, wow, here's a person that owns their truth, and they're still okay, and I could own my truth and maybe I could still be okay. That, of course, that's such a gift. That's such an incredible gift. And where I struggle with this idea of things will take time is that I'm nervous. In my state alone, there are a multitude of legislative drafts in regards to education that are attempting to limit the ability for those moments to happen, right? And they are coming in full force. There are more legislative drafts looking to remove students' access to that experience, that growth and understanding when it comes to different cultural differences, identity differences, whatever. There are more legislative drafts looking to remove access to that than there are looking to ensure or strengthen access to that level of dialogue within education. And when I hear it's going to take time, I do feel a sense of panic because it makes me very nervous if we aren't able to act quickly. I really feel sometimes the other side of the equation that would like to reduce DEI. There's actually a draft in my state that literally says they would like to remove DEI, socio-emotional learning, and critical race theory from all curriculum and content. All of it. So that's an actual draft, and luckily it was voted not likely to pass, and it's been archived. It's not gone through, but that doesn't mean that there aren't still people with that particular mindset who are pushing hard, aggressively to make these changes in education. And I get nervous sometimes when we're like, well, we understand based on structural theory and organizational theory and sociological, ideological changes and how long they take, that this takes time. I become concerned because the other side, I'm not sure they're always so passive in, I'm not sure they always relinquish their understanding to this idea that it takes time or
Right.
and so I'm not, I get nervous anyway when people talk.
Yeah, and I think that that sense of nervousness and that sense of like urgency is real, and it's something that I struggle with it as well. And it took several years for me anyways, but I'm at a point now where we like yeah, I'm willing to act, and I, with the position that I have and the level of power that I have within the four walls of my classroom, I
Mhm.
want to make a difference. I want to use that in a way that is going to promulgate change, that is going to remove barriers. And as
And it's
much as
hard.
it
Don't get me
is.
wrong, you really have to walk a fine line. You have to be super careful. You have to look and figure out, I'm in a district that would tolerate up to so much of what? You know what I mean? Like, how far can I push the boundary before I would lose my position of influence because they're not going to employ me here anymore?
And that's a
But
real issue, and that comes down to the people that are holding positions of authority to release people for sharing that kind of or adopting those kinds of policies and practices, which is why you know um, which is why it's so important that we have people assuming those positions, or we really rethink those positions in ways that allow people that are going to promote change that benefits everyone to assume those roles. Because you're right, we have this pocket of individuals that seek to exercise their authority in ways that furthers their agenda, that furthers what they believe to be right by educating kids. And
their harmful agenda, their
yeah,
disenfranchising agenda, their oppressive agenda, um, and that's scary.
it is scary, but I think what would be scarier is if the people that understood what was going on stayed silent. I think there's a call to action that we all bear in kind of in rewriting this narrative and acting in ways that are going to counter some of these incredibly harmful things. If you look at some of the things that are happening down south in
Yeah.
particular, and the kinds of legislation that's passing down there, and it's absolutely appalling, and
Yes.
it's appalling in so many ways, and it's become the same kinds of conversations that we've been able to fortunately have with students in our classroom setting in Massachusetts, and we're very lucky to live in a state where we're able to have those conversations, and we're able to plant those seeds and to help this generation coming up see these issues in a much more progressive and informed kind of light. Um, and I
I agree. And I feel privileged to be able to do that in my district also. I think I've worked in a district where I did not feel safe in that way, and that was really scary, and that was the reason that I left ultimately.
Yeah, me
Um,
too.
and so I feel really lucky to be able to do the work that I do in the district that I'm in. I will say sometimes I feel frustrated because I'm not sure that that's really where the work is needed the most. And I feel like if I was able to do the same kind of thing but in a district where that representation of understanding of differences, and really I think ultimately what this comes down to, my opinion, cultural proficiency, this representation of cultural proficiency that not only allows for cultural differences but supports cultural differences and values cultural differences, like a Nuri-Robins model of cultural proficiency, which is what I think DEI is attempting, or is a huge part of building. Um, there are communities or districts where that's needed so desperately, and those are generally the ones that we can't access,
Right.
or
And
where people feel the least safe to do the work.
exactly, which is why it's so. I think it's just so important where we see that and we understand that, and many others do see that and understand that, to act and not stay silent about it, and to continue to push in ways that are going to counter that, because it is toxic, and we're talking about the lives of students here that are being adversely affected in families and communities across the nation, and it's incredibly disheartening and it's incredibly frustrating.
Which
um,
develops the urgency. I think any of us, and I'm sure this has happened for you. In fact, I'm sure it's happened for many teachers, a lot of teachers, most teachers even. When you sit across from a student who you've grown to adore and value, um, and that student breaks down to you about a particular identity marker that they're experiencing that they feel they can't be honest about because of fear of retaliation or harassment or discrimination or disappointing their family or whatever, and their mental health is being impacted so significantly, it's at crisis levels. It no longer feels like an issue where we can be like, well, it's just going to take time for people to come around. In
right.
those moments, it feels like, no, people need to get on board right now. This kid's actual life is at stake. And
A
that,
big reason why I think it's important to get involved and to not like we it's get involved, get involved in groups, be a part of committees, be a part of those hearings, those school committee meetings, those meetings where policies or procedures are being rewritten, or
mhm,
lobbying to people of power in office for change, because it's not going to come, like it won't come overnight, but it's also certainly not going to come if we don't take the time to exercise what we're able to do to plant those seeds. We can't. It's so frustrating, and it's even more frustrating as a teacher, because I oftentimes will just feel like I'm doing the most that I can within this little microcosm of space that I'm given.
yeah,
um, but then I think about if I was just that teacher that said, nope, not the time, not the place, I don't want to be talking about that, I value my job, I'm
right,
probably getting something that's worse.
right,
I'm probably getting something that's potentially going to just that's not going to help a student out, or even
Right.
just plant the seed to give them some hope later on. So it might be pushing the envelope a little bit, but I would much rather push that envelope a little bit than sit back and allow these preposterously egregious things to take place.
Right. Well,
So
and this and that's part of, like, I think, or what that reminds me of is Ibram Kendi's his definition of being an anti-racist versus being not racist, right? And this idea that if you're just not racist, if you just classify yourself as not racist, then that's a passive action. That's saying I'm not doing anything that would be identified as racist. But that is, in fact, a level of racism, because in order to be truly in resistance to racism, you have to be anti-racist. It's an active action. It's not enough to just personally hold that value or ideology and then, impact yourself with that or your choices with that. You have to also actively do things like speak out against racism, vote with a vote that is anti-racist or supports candidates with anti-racist policies and ideas. That it takes more than just the passive notion of being not racist. And I think that can be applied to any of these areas, right? It's not
yeah,
enough to say I'm not homophobic or I'm not anti-LGBTQ. You have to be, I guess in that sense we'd call it pro LGBTQ, right? Like you'd have to
right.
be taking an active role in promoting the inclusion and equity and diversity of your district in relationship to all of these areas of marginalized or vulnerable status.
Yeah, and you say that word vulnerable, and I think that's a big part of it too, because there's vulnerability is so key in all of this. Like,
Right.
I hold DEI near and dear to my heart for my own experiences and for my own being a student, through NEC, but also just as a classroom teacher. And there's plenty of times where I'm thinking I'm doing what's right by kids, or adopting policies or acting in ways that are removing these barriers, or that are promoting diversity, equity and inclusion. But
Mhm.
I think there's obviously times where I don't realize I'm being biased, or I don't realize that what I'm doing is actually disenfranchising or is shortchanging another population of students. I may be well intentioned, and I may think that I'm doing right by it, but I think it's a matter of being vulnerable. Like if someone were to bring
Right.
that to my attention and take the time to explain to me and educate me about why that wasn't anti-racist, or why that wasn't, or whatever, I think there's a level of vulnerability that people need to be okay with and be
Oh
willing to
yeah.
receive or exercise. And I think that's something that's really, really hard for many people to be able to do. It's hard. It's I don't want to say it's attacking somebody necessarily, but it's also bringing to light things that need to be brought to light if we're going to effectively change the way that we're interacting with each other and our students.
And
Um,
the documents that I looked at that I sent to you that were current, like recent publications about how to implement DEI practices and protocols, policies, ideas, initiatives in education effectively, all of them discuss this idea of honesty, integrity, vulnerability, um, being able to listen openly and honestly, and also being able to speak openly and honestly, to be vulnerable, to hold integrity for other people in your, in your school that are also learning and doing this work with you. Those people have to be able to trust that what's said or done within a meeting is held in confidence of that meeting while people are doing the work of trying to grow in these areas. And um, I know that that's a huge hot topic. I think every single time I've been in a room with people that are talking about DEI related topics, inevitably one person says, I'm going to ask this question, and I apologize in advance if I'm not using the right language or if I'm saying this in a way that could be offensive. I truly don't mean to be offensive. I'm open to hearing feedback about how I should be wording this or saying this to come across clearly and with the intention of what I'm trying to do, which is I'm seeking to learn. So, and then they say their comment, and then because they're worried. They know that
Yeah.
to some extent there will be a stigma, and they're worried about that too, but they're trying to be vulnerable. And if there's one person doing that in every meeting, there's probably half the people who are thinking that
Oh,
at least.
yeah. Yeah. And the fact that someone is taking the time to make that remark it tells me that they're coming from a good place, and they may not have access to the language or to the understanding, but they're coming from a good place. And I think it would be wise of the people on the receiving end to hear that, to see that, and to be willing to engage with them in that level of vulnerability and help them understand, what the right terminology would be, or how we would address that, or how we could use more inclusive language or practices to kind of address the things that were being shared. So I think it's reciprocal. I think, as we're going through this process, it's going to take vulnerability on both sides, and a willingness to grow and to continue to kind of develop along the way, because none of us are perfect at this. And I don't think any one of us are going to get it right the first time. And I think there's a lot of growth and a lot of flirting with this vulnerability that needs to happen on both ends.
I'd love to. I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead. You're fine.
I'd love to share with you something I learned once that I thought was one of the most brilliant ways to deal with conversations about topics where a person is seeking to learn, but they may not know enough yet to not say things inappropriately. And it's through the Human Library Organization, which was developed in Copenhagen, Denmark. Are you familiar with that?
I have heard of human libraries before,
Yeah.
yes.
I love this project. And in my former district, I implemented a human library. It was a digital one, where people would sign up for times to log on and be available to have conversations with students based on their perspective, like from their sociological minority marker, right?
Right.
So I had people that had done time in prison. I had people that were refugees. I had people that were part of the LGBTQIA plus community. I had people from different races, nationalities. I had single mothers. I had people who grew up in generational poverty, like all the different vulnerable or marginalized groups I could get my hands on that would be even remotely willing to participate. I tried to put in there. And then the students were able to access time and essentially check out one of the human books to have a conversation with them about their experience within that group. And in order to do that, I knew that a lot of my students came from cultures that used inappropriate or offensive or hurtful language when talking about certain sociological minorities. So I said, I used the kind of terms that the Human Library Organization used, which I thought were brilliant. And one of them was, if someone said a question or asked a question of one of the books, and it was said in such a way that was hurtful or was offensive or wasn't clear, then the human book was able to say, so that, and it had to start with, ouch, that stung. That question hurt my feelings. Is there a way you could find to reword that so that I could give you the best answer?
Oh, I love that.
They would just keep going until the person, and the person's next question might be, can you tell me how you would word it? Or can you help me understand why it was? Or maybe they would just think, oh, I actually know another way to say this that might be less offensive. And then they would come up with a less offensive way. But it was always that, ouch, that question stung. Is there a way you could reword that so that I could give you a clear answer because that hurt my feelings, or something like that? And then, and it gave that person an opportunity to do that without feeling like, I just messed up, I'm just going to stop talking about this. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah, and it
And then,
became a learning moment for that person. That's wonderful.
and if it was a boundary cross, if it was like the person was asking a question, it wasn't about how they were wording it, but more it was just crossing an inappropriate boundary, then the book was able to say, I can't answer that question because I haven't written that chapter yet. which basically meant like, I'm not gonna tell you that. I'm not comfortable with talking about that. I'm not gonna share that. But without saying like, I'm not comfortable talking about that. I'm not going to tell you that, which feels like something that someone would have to be, defensive to. So, so there was like a clear set of dialogue or language that people could use within these conversations to reduce that um, sort of potentially contentious or controversial dynamic. And I thought that was really brilliant. And I know that that's a really important part because all of these different references that I used to look at how people are approaching DEI within education currently or recently, they all talked about how vulnerable it can be and how hard it is to be a person that says, hey, I'm learning about this. I don't know that much about this yet. I see a space where maybe I could grow and learn more and seek to understand. But at this time, I'm not there yet. So I'm going to need some help sort of walking through this. And I feel like if more people had access to that kind of dialogue, that kind of dynamic in talking about these things, we could do more of this work more quickly.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter like I love that because I remember in a couple different schools and even in the school that the high school I went to growing up, we had a program through the Anti Defamation League called the World of Difference. It was the World of Difference Institute that trained students who are sophomores and juniors to ultimately become diversity leaders within their own school, where those same students that were trained would go back to their schools and they would have these lessons or they would have these they would have lessons with typically freshman level students. I'm pulling from my own experience, and actually I was able to do something like this past year too. But and I remember one of the lessons that we would do with these freshman level students, mind you I was a junior or senior when this was happening,
Mhm.
was really just I think we called it oops and ouch. We had these ground rules where and expectations where the idea, what was communicated was that we're going to be engaging in topics that are they're a little more heavy at times, and we may not always have access to the language or the background to really understand what we're saying could be considered offensive or that it
Right.
could potentially, be deemed harmful to somebody else, and that we would use these terms as a platform to grow. And it was really a matter of making sure that kids were just held accountable to using these terms appropriately for one, setting the expectations firm. But it became a very impactful way to help start planting those seeds for kids to understand and to really kind of internalize that language and to begin to move towards a greater DEI kind of lens. Um,
Absolutely.
so I love that. And I was able to see something like that this past year too. So it is out there. And I think it's something that we're considering as a district doing next year. Like this was when I was in high school, and it happened to be that I was asked to attend this conference sponsored by the ADL to do this. So I agree. And I think for adults, I think that it can definitely become more of a challenge. And I think the
Mhm.
challenge really just comes down to people's willingness to engage with it and their willingness to be vulnerable and to admit that they perhaps didn't see something the way, or they didn't, a willingness to be able to admit that they were wrong or that they misinterpreted or didn't have an understanding of what that term really meant or how it could be seen as offensive, and then being willing to learn from that experience and having that same kind of underlying expectation for all people, and I think that can be challenging. And I do think that there's people that are very, resistant to that. But I think there's also a lot of people that, if given the opportunity and the platform to do that, would be willing and able to learn from that experience. So that's really wonderful that you were able to have that experience with your own kids. And I would love for there to be more opportunities like that for not only for students, but for adults, because we're all
Me
human.
too.
We all make mistakes. And the only way that we grow as human beings and learn is through those mistakes and being
I mean,
willing.
how great would it be to have like a class where literally it's just a human library and you can access people and work through some of these challenges in understanding different sociological minorities that lead to these biases and stereotypes and
Yes.
prejudices.
And stories above all too are so impactful. Like it's one thing to
Right.
hear about it in a slideshow or a presentation or in a book, but it's another to actually engage
Stories.
the person to hear it in a story.
Right.
Yes.
It's when there's a face to put to the story. It's when there's an actual human being in front of you who you realize you otherwise would have just treated like any other human being. And now you're realizing that maybe upon, hearing this about them, you would have treated them differently. And that engaging in that kind of cognitive dissonance is so powerful in changing the way that students think about their own values and ideologies and whether or not they truly are theirs, or have they adopted them from somewhere else and they're not really representative of how they feel. So I think it's hugely beneficial and powerful. I wish there were more opportunities from them, but I really like how they talk about being able, like they address immediately being able to discuss issues with people who aren't yet ready to talk about those things in the most appropriate way because they just don't have the foundational understanding or knowledge of the
Right.
topic. So, and that's okay, because if you're seeking to learn, you're seeking to understand, it's okay if you don't already know yet. The problem is when we're like, I don't know yet, and also I don't want to.
Right.
But
It's another
when
challenge.
someone's willing to say, I don't know that much about this, but I'd be willing to learn, like that's where we have to capture. And kids are so willing to learn, which is something we don't give them credit for enough. They really are, in ways that like adults sometimes could benefit from attempting to exemplify.
Yeah, for
They're so,
sure.
they're so willing to be adaptable and to learn and to be flexible if you give them the opportunity.
That's where it
Um,
is. It's the opportunity.
and they're willing to change and develop. They need the support. So I think something like that would be super helpful. But I do really think overall, from my understanding of this challenge, I'll tell you a little bit about what I found. First, it requires, as a challenge in education, implementing DEI initiatives, PD policies, whatever, requires that people are able to get comfortable, that they know why they're doing it, that you can remove this illusion of, well, we just have this problem and we need to stop the problem, by also talking about how to stop the problem with real ideas, not just, theoretical constructs or really abstract broad strokes of change, with like real practices and protocols and resources and tools, reevaluating people's approach within the classroom, which is always a hot topic. um,
It is. It is. But we got to start somewhere. We definitely we do. We need, and educators, as educators, we want something that we can learn today and then
right.
we can start to apply tomorrow. And it's a matter of, it's not a matter of broad strokes anymore, because it's out there and we've done the broad strokes. Many people have done the broad strokes. They've checked the box, they've moved on. No, now it's a matter of actually doing the work and anticipating the challenges ahead, and then, with that knowledge, thinking of and being intentional with ways we're going to address those challenges.
And I really want to be very direct about a couple of things when I say that I think more districts need to implement PDs and initiatives, protocols and policies, ideas that are representative of having DEI in mind. Because I think a lot of people put DEI in their mission vision. And I think if you have a school of 100 educators who know that DEI is in their mission vision statement, you are probably looking at 100 different definitions of what that means. And so I think it's important that when this work is done, everyone participates. And I read that in one of the articles that I was using to research, that participation can look like a lot of different things. And whether that's people talking and asking questions, or that's people just sitting and listening, genuine participation is super critical. And I want to make sure that's very clear. No disingenuous, I'm at this meeting, but I'm actually doing grading, or I'm responding to emails, or I'm texting with a friend. Like real, genuine participation. And also, the most important to me, the thing that I would like to make clear is that from everything that I looked at for resources on this topic, it is critical that we make sure people understand that sociological minorities do not have to do the work tax of representing their minority group when doing this kind of work. They don't have to be the voice of that minority group. They don't have to share their experience. They don't have to be treated like subject matter experts on what it means. They don't have to be treated like their experience is representative of the whole. And it's so important that we remember that, because it's so frequent that I've seen people implement DEI in schools and then look to the marginalized to be the voice or the representatives of that initiative. And it is not their work to do.
No. And it's not a responsibility that they bear. Everybody bears the same shared responsibility for DEI. I love
Right.
that you said having that equal representation of people and everybody being fully participative in efforts like this, whether that's actively listening and internalizing things, or that's actually being vocal and engaging in a different way. But everybody
Right.
shares a stake in doing this kind of work, and everybody really needs to be immersed. And yeah, that makes total sense. Like, not every person that's African American has gone through the same experiences that the other, African American individual has undergone. That's not to say that other people haven't experienced that, but it would not be productive to assume or to be looking to those people for for insights, or for, unless they of course have things to share, in which case
In which
obviously.
case they should be allowed to, as should everybody.
Right.
But it shouldn't be the responsibility of sociological minorities to do the work of setting up and creating and implementing and speaking for or advocating for DEI work.
Right.
That's not fair.
It's a shared
And,
responsibility.
if people are willing to share, that's beautiful. And that's super helpful. And I love when people get to a level of comfortability within themselves that they want to share their experience to educate others, but it's not mandatory. And it's not a work tax that they have to bear any more than any other individual. And by that I mean everyone should be involved, everyone should be participating genuinely, but not any more than any one other person, based on the
Exactly.
fact that they may or may not have more marginalized or vulnerable identity markers than, this person over here. And so I think that that's really important. I mean, I love to give PDs and talk to people about ADHD, as a person that has struggled with ADHD for a long time and has a really interesting history with figuring out exactly what was going on in this brain. I I love to talk to people about it, especially being an adult with ADHD who also has kids with ADHD, who also works with kids with ADHD. I love to talk about it and all the different types of treatment. But if my school came to me and said, you have to give a presentation on let's say being a woman, or you need to give a presentation on being pansexual, I I would be really frustrated by that.
Right. That would be like my administrator approaching me to have a conversation about being gay in front of everybody. And yeah, no,
I would have to say no to that, because I actually don't have to do that, and that's not my job. However, if you hold everyone does their own PD, and we do like a walk around PD, which are my favorite PDs, by the way,
yes.
where everybody's like bringing their own thing to the table, and you can sign up for the different seminars. I would be like, could I do my ADHD PD? Because I love to talk. I love to talk to people about that and just give them ideas on what is most helpful or successful. What are some of the things they should pay attention for with students who are starting new types of neurochemical modulators and that kind of thing. So I love talking about that. And that's okay. And I should be given space to do that. You know what I mean?
Right. Given the space is key.
Right. So, as we've talked about this a lot already on this episode, I know that you brought this topic up because you see this largely as an adaptive challenge, and so do I. Um, I like to use Bowman and Deal's framework of understanding organizational structure to look at adaptive challenges. I think it's comprehensive enough. I think that it gives people a lot of space to understand the implications of challenges within organizations. Bowman and Deal have 4 frames for which they identify being frames or lenses that you can view organizational challenges through. And in particular, they have the first frame, which is a structural frame, and the symbol for that is the factory. The structural frame has to do with everything that organization creates, how they create it, the policies, the protocols, the tools, the resources, what they're making, what service they're providing. Um, they have a second frame, the human resources frame, and the symbol for that is the family. It's this idea that there are interpersonal relationships and human conversations and relationships within every organization that have a powerful role in the success of that organization. Next, they have the third frame, the political frame. The symbol for that is the jungle, and it's this idea that there's a hierarchy to power and influence within every organization.
Right.
And lastly, there's the symbolic frame, which is the symbol for that is the temple. It's the answer to the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we here? Why do we exist? It's what is our mission, our vision? What's our why? Right. So, and then Neil worked with me on collaborating. We collaborated together on our article proposing the eudaimonia frame, which is the 5th frame. That would be it's theoretical, this concept that Bolman and Deal's frames could benefit from a 5th frame that talked about the synergy, the collaboration, the harmony of all of those different dynamics of an organization working together to make each component successful and effective.
Right.
And how that requires a level of tuning to one another. So our symbol is the tuning fork, tuning to the same key, if you will, like when you're trying to build an orchestra or a band and you want everyone to be in line with one another so that all of the work is going towards the same conceptualization of how this should be done, why it's being done, where it's being done, who's doing it, what impact is it going to have, that kind of thing. So often we know that when that looks great, it looks like people talking about it was a really fun place to work, or I loved being a part of that organization because everyone was so supportive, things worked so efficiently, and I felt like I belonged there, like I was welcomed, and it was really positive experience for me. We know when it's not working because people will say something was just off. I just didn't enjoy being there. Everything felt very negative. Everything felt like it was, working by itself individually. Nothing felt like it was coming together. Everyone was off doing their own thing. So we know what it looks like when it's not working and when it is, although it is a relatively abstract idea for a frame. So when I think of DEI in education, I think of the different lenses that this or frames that this could fall under, but I'd like you, Neil, to talk a little bit about how you see this working within Bolman and Deal's theoretical framework for understanding organizational structure.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, the first thing that jumps out to me when we talk about DEI, when we talk about education, and we talk about adaptive issues within education, I see all of these frames really bearing a lot of weight. But the first thing that jumps out to me right now is the political frame, and this idea of it being a jungle and this hierarchy of power. And I also think about the resources that schools are afforded, particularly funding, and how there's the way that funding is distributed to schools plays such a big part in what is taking place, or the kinds of ideology that is being instilled into a district, or even at the state level or federal level. even within an individual school setting, you're going to have a wide variety of individuals that want to compete for these resources, that compete for the funding, that really want to have a say or to exercise some authority in the kinds of things that are happening or are not happening or being included in the curriculum or not being included in the curriculum. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important from a leadership perspective to be cognizant of those multiple stakeholders, those multiple interest groups that exist in any organizational setting. And then, being sure that those interest groups or those particular individuals all share some sort of stake or some sort of they're able to exercise some level of voicing their perspective when it comes to making decisions, when it comes to crafting a mission or a vision statement, or when it comes to being a part of these DEI efforts, right? Because it's not going to be just a one person kind of deal doing the work. It needs to be everybody that's engaged, that's working together towards this common good, towards better practices. So I definitely think about the political frame. I definitely see the structural pieces coming into play, a structural frame really coming into play. I think as
Mm-hmm.
we start to really or continue to move towards more DEI based policies and practices at a systemic level, whether it's in a school or a school district or even at a state or federal level, we're really going to have to rethink some of the structures that are in place. We're going to have to really think about the resources, the services, the policies that govern, how schools function or how schools operate, to be inclusive, to be ones that are addressing these barriers that we know and we can support with research exist. It's just going to be a matter of identifying them and then really taking the time to be intentional about how we're going to change or rethink the structure. I definitely think about human resources, those interpersonal relationships. I think about the professional development that we're all responsible for engaging with, that we're all responsible for learning from growing towards, and really being able to use the positions that we're in as a way to continue to continue to grow and um, to continue to do what we do best, but in a way that is going to reflect DEI practices, or that's going to at least grow in that direction, right? Human resources is all about that idea of family and those interpersonal relationships, that vulnerability, and affording
Right.
ourselves and one another that level of vulnerability is going to be a key piece. The symbolic frame, yeah, for sure. Like if we're thinking about what is the ultimate goal of a school or a district or, even a department of education, we're really thinking broadly. We're really thinking at a much broader level in terms of what we hope the outcome of students, this upcoming generation, to be. And that's going to certainly include a wide variety of individuals. It's going to really include a wide variety of values and stakeholders, and really taking the time to be intentional with what are the common themes, what are the common themes from this group and this group and this group and this group that we want for kids, and how do we somehow weave that together to create some sort of vision that incorporates, or at least attempts to incorporate, as many of those purposes or that why as we can. No small feat for sure. But and then eudaimonia, boy, what better like a tuning fork or a
Sure.
barometer for understanding, or getting a sense of whether or not this is jiving together, this is meshing together, right? Are we being intentional about the people that we want, or that should be supporting, or that everyone should be supporting this? Um, are we seeing the structures that we have in place,
Mm-hmm.
working in conjunction with the people that we have in place and the different viewpoints that we have from a political frame or a political frame? I think it's going to be probably the best barometer that we have, and the best sense that what we've created is working, or that it's functioning in a way that is making progress, right? And it's functioning in a way that is creating this synergy over time. And I think the best way that we can kind of see that is with our own students, and seeing how students respond to these kinds of changes that we would make, whether it's policy or
Absolutely.
procedure. I think they're going to be the best ones to be able to tell us. Kids, as we know, are the best. They're the best when it comes to that stuff. We don't give them enough credit. And I think as we
They
go
know
through this, it's going to
much
be important to
more
them.
about education for 21st century learners than we probably will ever know,
Yes,
because it's just
absolutely.
so different. Well, I know you're younger than me, but it's so, I'm sure you can understand when I say that it's so different in comparison to what I experienced for education.
Oh, for sure, for
Not
sure.
just because I'm a different person or I grew up in a different area or whatever. It's different in the sense that what they're combating every day at school for challenges foundationally are different than what I was worried about or what I had going on. And that plays a huge role. I think from what you're saying, it sounds like your feeling is that this particular adaptive challenge falls under every frame. There's a place to understand this challenge within the definition of every framework that
Yeah, I think it's
Bolman.
important to consider all of those frames. I think if we're just solely focusing on, I mean, the political one jumps out to me right away. But I
Sure.
think anybody that is in a position to influence or that's in a position to affect change, which we all are, I think we'd be remiss to not use each and every one of those frames to the most of our advantage, the most that they'll allow us to, and to use that to continue to push forward and to grow. And I think I think taking into account all of those frames yields as much perspective and as much insight and as much as we can avail ourselves to if we're really going to be intentional about considering and actually doing this kind of work. We have to consider it from all of these angles. If we're solely focusing on one or two, we're blindsided to other angles that might hinder or otherwise redact some of our efforts.
I completely agree. I think that this particular adaptive challenge falls under every frame. I'll give you a spoiler alert. That's what I've concluded at the end of every episode I've done so far of this podcast, is that these adaptive challenges are so complicated that they actually fall within each of the frames in terms of sometimes some of them more or less than others, but still there's an angle by which we have to consider or understand that challenge using every frame. For this one, I would say, well, anytime there's a cultural proficiency issue on the table, I feel that falls under eudaimonia, because a strong part of eudaimonia for me is the culture and climate with which a person is experiencing an organization. Um, and whether that culture or climate has tuned to the same tuning fork or not. And we know sometimes when it hasn't, because when we go to the DEI PDs or developments, there's always the late adopters who will say things like, "Ugh, another one of these," or something to the effect of, "I didn't pay attention," or "I'm so sick of this," or "I'm just going to go back to my classroom and pretend I went," or whatever. And so you know that not everyone is tuned to this idea that this is a topic we need to be working on and needs our focus and attention. And I think that in terms of a structural frame for understanding, that's hugely critical for this particular adaptive challenge. If the policies, the protocols do not support, if the curriculum and content do not support this vision of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive educational experience, you'll never get there. Right?
Exactly.
It's never going to happen.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you're not ever going to have a strong, safe, trusted relationship with integrity between students and adults in the building, or students and other students, or adults and other adults, if people don't feel represented, included, like they have access to equity and opportunity, right?
Right.
And you're never going to have DEI genuinely implemented within a district if the powers that be, those who are making decisions at the highest level for education, do not also see DEI as a critical value in reforming education. If they are not willing, with all of their influence and power, to make changes to policies that are done with equity and inclusion and diversity in mind, with cultural proficiency in mind, then you just won't ever get there.
Exactly.
And also, if And I know a lot of schools are really good at putting DEI statements or even just the term DEI into their mission and vision. And so that's great because it means they're hoping to do that. It's like,
But that's
I
where it
want to
stops.
be good at this.
And it's disheartening, and it's frustrating that that's become the norm for a lot of schools, and
Mhm.
a lot of people experience that. And I'll be the first to admit that there's districts I've worked in where we'll do it. We've talked about it in this one particular school year, and then the next year it just falls off, and it becomes a
Mhm.
different flavor that school year. Now we're talking about whatever else. Um,
Right.
this is
But
where
if it's in there, if it's like an active part of the mission and vision where people are considering that in a valuable way. I think my school does a brilliant thing where they will give you credit for PD. Even if you do something on your own, you'll get credit hours for PD if it relates to DEI, if you can prove that it is something to promote DEI in education, because that's one of their goals, right? So that's policy. There's like three things you can click. One of them is socio-emotional learning, one of them is DEI. But if you do that, that is a policy that promotes the mission and vision of DEI as a critical component of the educational experience. That makes sense, right?
right.
And so I think that, there are certain things that can be done that if the mission and vision, if it's not just written in there, but it's also genuinely a part of the mission and vision and is promoted that way, then there are ways to make sure that that frame is fulfilled.
Yeah, and it's gonna take a village, and it's gonna take people actually doing the work and learning from mistakes, and no longer just talking the talk, but walking the walk, and giving
Absolutely.
ourselves the gift of vulnerability, and giving each other the gift of vulnerability, and getting the right people, the people that into those positions that are going to affect that kind of change. It's a call to each of us to work together
Right.
to make that happen. And it's really, it's a matter of just actually taking the steps to do it, because so often we become jaded when we talk about it, we talk about it, we talk about it, and then we don't actually make a policy or actually do anything that's going to push us further along. So it's really wonderful to hear that your district is doing that. My district, we actually, as a science department, met this past year. um, and we really started to look at the ways that our curriculum, I'm a science teacher, so it was very easy right away to see, oh wow, what a surprise, we're talking about a bunch of old dead white guys, right? These old scientists, yeah. And so we're really thinking about ways that we can address some of that going into the school year next year,
Yeah.
right? We can really start to diversify the representation of female scientists and scientists of color, and
You
really
know,
taking the time to do that.
can I make a recommendation?
Yeah, all ears.
Found that students love developing curriculum they know future students are going to partake in, because it gives them that sense of agency in the learning experience, and they also feel empowered at the notion that they would be building future experiences for students that are coming up behind them.
Love that.
And if you were to ask them to do a research project, but they have to do a person in a field of science that is notably forgotten from the canon, and you would have to kind of explain to them what that looks like. So, for some reason, despite the fact that this person did all of this work and was incredibly powerful in, building this field of study, they are not acknowledged as the father of that field of study or whatever. And you allowed them to really dig deep, and it can be in any field. So you really open up, like when I say you can research anything, key players, people who have given to and developed this field of research, but less is known about them. I think that you would find they would be really excited about that. The very first episode that I did, um, in this podcast, I had a student where he came on and he talked a little bit about diversifying content and how that was really important to him, that more the voices of the unheard, the voices of the oppressed or the marginalized be more represented in modern education was really critical to him. And he talked about the danger of the single story.
Right.
When we only hear from, like, we only learn about colonialism from the accounts of people who were doing the colonizing. Right. So he talked a lot about that. And he was so empowered. And one of the things he talked about was how we don't hear that much about Tesla. We hear a lot about Edison.
Yeah. Tesla's. Yeah.
I just panicked for a second that I was saying the wrong thing. So
no, you got it. Tesla was that one that actually discovered electricity.
Right. And so he was talking about it because he was talking about how Thomas Edison's idea of creating electricity from a capitalist perspective, where he wanted to be rich and famous, he wanted to make the money, he wanted to profit off of this, versus Nikola Tesla, whose version of creating or of sharing electricity with the world looked more socialist. It looked more like, I now know how to do this, let me just give everyone access to this. Right. That did not promote the same values or the same agenda that the country was currently looking to foster. And so one got pushed to the front of being the father of electricity and the other one didn't. And that comes down to just very a marginalization based on ideology and economic mindsets or beliefs. But he was really empowered to talk about that, and he researched a ton about it. He wanted to understand why Tesla was so marginalized, and it wasn't until recently that people became invested and interested in his story on a grander scale, more mainstream than it was before. So I think if you went to your students and you said, who would you want to learn about that we don't talk about? And maybe that's personal to them. Like, maybe if it was me, I would research women in the field of science. Or, maybe someone would look at people with disabilities in the field of science, or refugees in the field of science, or whatever, to really flush out whose work can we include based on, those students who felt impassioned to research them.
Yeah, talk about an impactful way of giving kids autonomy, but also bringing to light those people that are, have been historically marginalized, or people that, like you said, have just kind of been pushed back while these other people have been pushed forward, And I think that's something we're really trying to be more mindful of, but it's a step in the right direction, and I think the little steps over time make a big difference. And the more that we can do of that, and the more we can critically think about that and start making changes, the better off we're going to be.
I think that would be really beautiful. And think about how much more efficient that would be than you and your department being like, well, let's go find them. Let's go find the people we're going to include now.
Yep. Two birds, one stone.
We all talk about doing frequently, but we just don't always all have the time for.
Exactly.
And that's not fair, and we should, and it should be more of a focus for us, and we should be given more time to do it. However, the reality of teaching is such that the logistics we're inundated with minutiae. So instead we outsource that to the kids.
I like the way you worded that. Yes. But I mean, it's all for the betterment, right? It would be right by kids. It would be a great way to engage them, and it would be impactful for everybody to learn that,
And you get a little assessment out of it.
Right. Exactly.
Bada bing.
Win for everybody.
Neil, I really appreciate you coming on today and talking to me about this topic. DEI is so critical in our schools, and it's also so abstract and understood in different ways by a lot of different people at the same time. And I'm not sure everyone really understands fully how to approach it or what it means. And I think this episode has been full of some really great ideas about ways to think about approaching that in education, or what to keep in mind when putting in a new initiative or protocol. So I love that. And thank you.
And thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful experience, and I think it's a job that we all bear, and it's something that, I think we each share responsibility for, and there's certainly a lot to consider. But I think it's a call for all of us right now, especially to be mindful of and to be exercising as we go forward, and to no longer just be talking the talk, but walking the walk to what we know is right by kids.
I could not agree more. Brilliantly said. All right. Well, thank you so much, and I'll see you again soon. This was the Adaptive Edge of Education.
All right, thank you.